Hello, everyone, and welcome to one of our final workshops for the Investment New South Wales Going Global program, Cleantech to the US. We are so excited to head off to New York in about a week and a half now, and this will be a wonderful workshop providing an overview of the US clean energy space and the IRA legislation to help you prepare for that week in country. On the call today, we have Kyle Brauer, the co-founder of a US-based startup, Pencil Energy, and also Elie, who is a director of strategy at KPMG. Firstly, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I stand. That's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I want to also acknowledge that they were the first climate tech innovators in our country, and we have 60,000 years worth of knowledge to learn from them. I also support an Indigenous voice to Parliament. So today we will first be handing over to the wonderful Kyle. Kyle, if you'd like to just introduce yourself really quickly, and then we'd really love for this to be kind of a loosely structured kind of conversation between us all. So if you've got any questions, pop them in the chat. I'll be monitoring that one, or just take yourself off mute and ask right away. And without further ado, I'll pass over to Kyle.
Thanks. It's great to be here and an honor to share insights with you. Hopefully they will be helpful. I'll tell you about Pencil because I think it's related. Pencil is software to organize financial incentives for energy companies with a current focus on US policy. And I would love to give an overview of why this is needed. Hopefully that will shed some light on the IRA as well. I'm just going to share my screen. So the IRA is probably in the news all around the world, but that is only a single act. I took some time to collect information for you on example programs and the scope of how government works in the US to illustrate that it is one component of financial incentives for any project that is possible. And don't worry, we'll talk about the IRA in detail, but hopefully this can give you some context. IRA, 700 billion estimated value. What's interesting about that value, though, is a lot of the incentives are uncapped, which means that those are estimates based on projected demand. I forgot to mention this. This is not tax advice. I'm not a CPA or a lawyer. So please consult any tax professional and do not take this as such. That said, these are federal tax incentives. They apply to almost every aspect of the economy. I tried to think of a solar pun for everything under the sun, but I couldn't. So here's some interesting tidbits that you might like. There's several new things going on from the IRA that I want to highlight because some of your stated areas might be interesting. Something called energy communities. There is a huge increase in value to a credit if you locate certain types of projects in certain areas. And that's a way to help people who perhaps were working in coal and no longer can. So that's something we can talk about if you're interested. Elective pay is my favorite. I probably should have put it at the top. This is a really interesting policy innovation whereby non-profit organizations, including government entities, can receive a payment of the credit that they would have qualified for if they had a tax liability given the project. And that's interesting because normally an income tax credit would apply if you have an income for which you have a tax liability. So that's new and it's super hyped right now in the nonprofit and government space. And then last is HERA, which has a new acronym, apparently. I don't remember what it is, though. This is a weird point of sale rebate tax thing that is rolling out on a state-by-state level in the US. And optimistically, this will start occurring late this year, but most likely next year. So be familiar with these terms when you go to New York. If you read up on HERA and whatever it is now, that's really the talk of the town. But you'll sound very cool if you know about elective pay. Now I'm going to gloss over the other two or other three areas I included because they're really important. I've included three single programs from different levels of US government to illustrate how these things can vary. In California, we have something called the Self-Generation Incentive Program, which is a rebate with an asterisk. And I have the asterisk there because I recently read some IRS, US IRS guidance, and I need to catch myself. The IRS is the US Federal Tax Authority, if you didn't know. That says that state rebates may not actually be rebates under income tax law. I don't know what that means yet, but it's a thing. This is weird because it lets you get interesting rebates for different types of storage, resiliency, and generation things at a state level. And the structure is by mandating that the investor utilities in the state are allocating that funding based on their area. Then you have utilities. So energy utilities provide your electricity and your water and your sewer services in the US. And they also put out rebates. So you can get some money for a used car in LA, Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. And finally, we have something called the special district, which is really technical. And I won't talk about it right now unless you have a question. But just know that they can also create incentives. And here's why that matters. There are tens of federal entities that are providing funding in various ways, whether they're grants or in the case of IRS tax. There's other major laws that have come out that have increased funding for climate. State agencies number in the thousands. We estimate maybe 100 to several hundred, maybe even 1,000 that have climate related funding for their own grants, or they get grant money from the feds. There's 3,000 utilities, as I mentioned. They can also do rebates. There's 39,000 special districts. Some of those can offer rebates, and municipalities like the city of LA, where I live, is a municipality. And those are interesting. You should know this because you're going to New York. They have a huge effect on buildings. Look up, I forgot what it is. There's a major building ordinance that came out in New York that mandated basically a no gas infrastructure for new construction in buildings. That has been controversial, but also impactful. So cities are often the ones who are pushing the US toward cleaner futures. And then to really bring it down to earth, here is a case study that we have in our pitch deck, where I personally looked up all these programs and ran the numbers and figured out how much this fake person Joe could receive for buying a new electric vehicle given an address in this particular location in California. $14,000 off is quite a bit. It can matter for a lot of people. So those are my slides on incentives, my bread and butter. I have, I don't know about induction stoves. I've never cooked on a new one before, but they're
not
probably
good
better
for
than
stir fries.
not good for stir fry. I guess we'll have to live with worse stir fry in our net zero future. So I'll stop there. I would love to hand it off to the others here who can speak to details about the IRA.
Is it my turn then?
Yes,
Sorry,
please.
can you hear me? Yeah. Oh, let me just, sorry, I've got just some prompts here that will help me have a better flow of conversation, because I could talk about this forever. Okay. So just to give a bit of an overview of what the IRA is, as Kyle pointed out, it is an estimate at this stage, but it's essentially a fund of almost $500 billion. And that fund has a dual purpose. It's kind of a two birds, one stone situation here. The dual purpose is to support the energy transition, and specifically support consumers and organizations to migrate towards cleaner energy. And then the second one, of course, is it's in the name. It's around reducing the cost of living, but it's essentially allowing or enabling that energy transition without too much of a cost burden on the consumer. It's a really good idea in theory because there's been a lot of philosophical debate around the energy transition and the fact that the wealthy are going to be able to transition quite easily, but it does put some of the less advantaged people, put them in a worse situation because essentially they won't be able to afford clean energy in their daily lives. So it attempts to do both, and that's essentially the I guess the straightforward or the explicit objectives of that. Now, having said that, and just looking at the geopolitical landscape, and some of the motives behind the IRA, there's obviously a bit more to that. Another objective from the US government is to improve employment. So it is around bringing back some of the production and manufacturing capability onshore after years and years of outsourcing it to low-cost countries. There's now an attempt to bring it back and improve employment figures. And the other one, I think, which is a bit of an elephant in the room, is decoupling from China. As we know, a lot of this technology around clean energy comes from China. Solar panels, batteries, turbines, you name it. Wherever the process starts in the world, it ultimately all funnels into one place and then from there gets distributed over the world. So those are some of the other motives, if you will, behind the IRA. Now, what I'm going to talk about next is essentially what I've heard from my clients in Australia specifically, but also some of them globally, as to how the announcement of the IRA have landed and what kind of thinking it has caused. Um, and I think the most pessimistic, I guess, view of it is, which to be honest, was the first reaction from a lot of producers, both in Australia and in Europe as well. So anywhere that's not actually China, where they're kind of quite comfortable sitting on their laurels. But it's a concern that the IRA was essentially pulling all of those capabilities onshore to the US, which will create voids everywhere else. And so both the European Union, Australia, and other countries feel like they can't really compete with $500 billion with the I guess the magnitude of the IRA. And because they don't have a counter offer for producers in their respective countries, that will cause essentially a vacuum of capabilities away from their jurisdictions and into the US. Which is fair enough. At the end of the day, the IRA is a US policy for US citizens. So it's not designed to it's not designed, I guess, for to redraw the trade maps. It does serve a purpose for US consumers. The Once that has landed, I guess, and the dust is settled, a lot of other producers have started looking at seeing into the opportunity that's there. And if you think through energy technology, the supply chain, the value chain, sorry, of energy technology, it's quite long and it's quite complex. And once you look into it, it really becomes clear that it's impossible for the US to actually have or stand up the end-to-end capability in the required amount of time. Like that value chain is so long, is so complex that you need multiple parties involved in it. That's a very basic example is if you've got the manufacturing facilities, moving backwards on the value chain to the raw materials, the US might not have those deposits to the quality required to supply the raw materials for processing and then ultimately manufacturing. So people have seen the opportunity there to have indeed a cross-border collaboration on critical minerals as raw materials, moving into processing and advanced processing, and then into manufacturing of clean or renewable technology. The big question now is how. So how is that mechanism going to work? And in order to answer that, it might be helpful to look at what how the IRA was intended to be used. Before I do so, maybe I should actually pause and just ask if there's any questions so far on what I've outlined, or any other. No? Okay. Let me talk then about the IRA, how it's supposed to work, and then maybe try and answer how someone that is not in the US might benefit from the IRA, or what are some of my clients thinking about that. So I think Kyle highlighted before, the IRA is mostly tax incentives. So I think more than half of it is in both corporate tax and consumer tax incentives, meaning basically a check to refund the tax that you're liable for in the US. And then there's on top of that some loans and some grants, which is just a loan without having to pay it back, etc. But mostly it's in tax incentives. And so the only known mechanism for how to access the IRA today is through those tax incentives. So you will need to be a US taxpayer, be it either a consumer or a corporate incorporated in the US for tax purposes, and then access the incentives that way. So traditionally, you'd be paying X amount of tax, but because you're producing clean technology and contributing to the energy transition at a lower cost, then you get a tax incentive. Now, the problem occur, of course, is when you're not a taxpayer. How does that work? So a couple of use cases that I've got from my clients is we've got a mining and processing facility located in Australia that are sending their product. So let's say they're nickel. Let's say it's nickel that goes into the manufacture of EV batteries. They're sending their nickels to General Motors, for example, in the US. They're wondering how they can access this. And the answer is, well, we don't know the exact mechanism because, again, no details have been released on how that happens. But in theory, what could happen is that General Motors receives the tax incentives, because today there is no other way for non-US tax-paying entities to access that. And then General Motors, I guess, and the player in Australia decide how we're going to divvy up that incentives amongst ourselves. Lots of implication there. And again, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a tax specialist, but there's probably a lot of implication in terms of transfer pricing and all of that. It is doable. There's probably a cost associated with it. And there remains to be seen if doing so would make you non-compliant under the IRA, which means that the US side of it will lose that incentive or access to that incentive. What we do know is that that arrangement could happen with friendly countries. So recently, Biden has met with Albanese, so our Australian Prime Minister, and they've workshopped how they can make that happen. And I think Biden went back and opened up the possibility or the opportunity for other friendly countries to participate in this arrangement. So if you are a friendly country, and I'm using that loose term on purpose because we don't actually know what qualifies a particular country as a friendly versus not. If you're a friendly country, then you may be able to somehow participate in the IRA. That doesn't absolve you from the fact that you need a US counterpart that is receiving the incentive. So that is a, you know, it doesn't change today. I don't know if it will in the future. And so this is essentially the predicament that some of my other clients are seeing. As an example, we were working with an automotive manufacturer in the US who was looking at a minerals at a battery mine site located in Argentina to purchase that asset and essentially integrate vertically their production from mining down to battery manufacturing down to automotive manufacturing. And that essentially was deemed non-compliant because there was no free trade agreement between Argentina and the US. So it was deemed that this arrangement would make the US automotive manufacturer non-compliant under the IRA because there's certain thresholds that you need to satisfy. And in this particular example, something like more than 60% or 80% of your raw materials have to come from a friendly country. And having that asset located in Argentina would have tipped the scale for them and made them non-compliant, even though this is only one aspect of their business. I don't know if that makes sense. So, you know, even if it's just a one asset in a non-compliant location, runs the risk of your entire business and all of your products that you produce may be non-compliant in the US. I'm gonna pause here and maybe, I don't know, put it out to the group if there's any questions or some points of view that you want to elaborate on, anything you've heard today that you find interesting or intriguing.
Kyle, I saw you nodding along to a few of those points. Is that how you're seeing it on the ground from a startup perspective in the US?
Yeah, I'm definitely happy to speak to that. Let me just add a couple links. The first is Local Law 97 in New York that I was thinking of. The second speaks directly to the previous points about critical minerals. And so this is some information from the US Treasury Department, which houses the IRS. And so you can read some information about proposed updated regulations for free trade countries. So that could be an interesting thing to follow for those of you that are working with critical mineral suppliers. Not sure. I looked at some of you who are doing, and I'm going to get back to the startups now. Some of your companies and several of you are building software as it pertains to carbon management, perhaps energy efficiency within buildings, commercial sometimes. There are some really interesting applications indirectly where software providers can benefit from the IRA and other incentives. So for those of you who are helping owners decarbonize or otherwise reduce their energy load, which is kind of an emissions reduction, they are real estate owners' business is buying, managing, and then selling those assets. They have in their company's structures for doing building operations work. But I would say, as somebody who was in my previous company that I pivoted, was trying to sell to commercial owners, they are very slow adopters of technology in the US. They are very much the gut check type people at the top, decision makers. Look at asset managers and lower. These are kind of the middle manager people who are responsible for a building. They can directly benefit from these incentives because replacing a gas heating appliance of some kind, if they're a commercial building in their boiler room, or if they own a multifamily building across all of their units, can generate a huge tax credit, which is very valuable because sometimes a tax credit, and this is not tax advice, can have benefits beyond just the cash value of the credit. Some things to look up include tax equity financing. Things like this are very technical stuff that I don't know very much about, but at the large scale, perhaps I should not be talking about this. This is where there's a lot of interest in the IRA for developers, large scale developers. And in some cases, the same funds that are investing in real estate portfolios are also investing in those types of projects for the purposes of tax equity. So at some level, there are people in real estate who absolutely need to understand how these incentives apply, as well as they need to understand how to decarbonize. So that is a major pain. And in this local law 97, it's caused a lot of controversy in New York because owners are unsure how they will possibly be able to retrofit to meet the ever increasing regulation to decarbonize. So solutions that can help owners measure their carbon impact better, retrofit better, those are all needed. I wrote down some examples of what I've been seeing on the ground. My subjective view and sort of intuitive understanding, I'm not a Wall Street analyst, so I hope that this is sort of accurate, is in the US, these innovations that are appearing are organized vertically and they pertain to a technology. So solar is a technology category. A lot of these innovations on hardware, labor, workforce, and software are all related to solar. Move over to wind and you see that. Move over to electrification and you see that. Repeating over and over again. A great example, I can't remember whose company, but one of you is working on helping people understand how to decarbonize their building or their home, I believe. That model is very popular in the startup world in the US. So be aware. I can give you some names offline if you would like to see what similar US marketplace companies are doing in that.
That'd be great, Carl. That's me.
Yeah.
So that'd be awesome.
Yeah, if we're sharing email or other contact info after this, I'm happy to respond to any questions later.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
With that, I don't want to take too much of this particular time for that. So that's one example. Others include data providers. I think I saw one of you was doing, I forgot the exact term. This is like the optimization work for what seemed to be storage technologies. So I think it might have been Daniel's company related to battery systems or resilience. But there are grid scale solutions where commercial, like much bigger buyers would be interested in that. Related to this vertical idea, batteries are their own beast that I don't know very much about, other than you go all the way into deep tech where you have new chemistries coming out that are really exciting, but that have huge investment horizons. Whereas you have established lithium ion based batteries for vehicles, and there's room for software to support that supply chain. And that includes data providers like if you get really good at predicting grid energy transfer, that we've seen in the US too. One other thing I want to mention is I actually wonder if you all have been hearing this in Australia, but the carbon markets have been falling out of favor tremendously, and there is a lot of angst. I have friends who are founders in carbon management and carbon markets and who want to do work here. And it seems like they may, if you've seen those curves, they may have hit the bottom of the hype curve and are now in the trough. So if your ambitions include facilitating, what is it called? The avoidance credits. Even if you have the best avoidance credits in the world, they may not have a great audience right now in the US. There's this kind of I don't even know. I don't know how to describe it, but this idea that the best avoidance is like use less energy. So if you can show that with your solution, that's really compelling for people who maybe have, from a portfolio level, an incentive from their LPs to reduce their carbon footprint. So hopefully that's helpful, and I can drill into any particular example as needed.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks, Carl. So if a company is helping a stakeholder to decarbonize a building, for example, and that stakeholder is eligible for the IRA tax incentives, is the startup also eligible for a separate set of incentives, or is it only for the company, only for the stakeholder that's actually reducing their energy?
I'm going to start here and then I will pause. It's an intuitive question because for some incentives, the installer can capture it on behalf of the customer and reduce the price. For a tax credit, my understanding is you must have a tax liability against which you can apply a credit. A good example is here, I'll type it in here, energy efficiency home improvement credit. This credit is the IRA's, they call it energy property. You can even get a credit for insulating doors up to several $100s. So that would be just the consumer. But if you can help a consumer understand how to get that credit more easily, maybe there's value there.
Yeah, and I agree with that. So if it's about the tax incentives, only an entity or an individual with the tax liability in the US are able to access those. In theory, grants and loans, yes, you may be able to access those, but it's highly unlikely given that they are there to encourage, to enhance employment in the US, bring back those manufacturing and tech capabilities onshore. It's highly unlikely that you would qualify if you weren't a US entity. I am going to say it seems that the stronger the commercial link between a supplier located elsewhere and the US entity is, the better chance you are at accessing that. The most extreme, I guess, version of that is if the US player just acquires the supplier that is located elsewhere in the US, and that way you're internalizing that, and then the benefit gets automatically, the benefit from the tax incentives gets automatically distributed across that value chain. And I guess the weaker version of that would be some sort of offtake agreement whereby the US entity pledges to purchase, a certain amount or volume of your products and services. But again, they would still need to work out the mechanism for essentially sharing the tax incentives, because only the US entity will access the tax incentive, and then they'll work out, okay, look, because you've been as a supplier, we know you're working exclusively with us. You've helped us be compliant under the IRA. We're going to give you this much. There will be some implications, some transfer pricing implications, so it will come at a cost, unless there's some sort of piece of legislation between now and the end of the year that says no. And there is talks, that there is something called a compact that's coming out later in the year, which is supposed to give a bit more detail as to how to do that transfer mechanism between the US and the friendly countries.
Yeah, wonderful. And this might be a little bit of an in the weeds question, but if a startup were to want to move to the US to take advantage fully of the IRA incentives, would they have to flip up and establish a parent, like the headquarters in the US, or would a holding co or a subsidiary or something like that also be eligible?
This is where the disclaimer comes into play. It will, regardless of what that structuring is, you'll need to look at the tax structure first and foremost. And it really depends on which structure makes it that the US entity is the one which is liable for the tax rather than anywhere else.
So we need a very good US tax.
We need a
lawyer as well.
Well, we need
who would also have a lot of disclaimers
banker
about personal circumstances and not being able to answer a straight question.
Yes, indeed.
It almost sounds like the opportunity for now, though, is really about, to your point, Kyle, what are all of those consumer opportunities? And so what is that push into market where you can support that, as opposed to trying to access direct funding from IRA? It's like, what are all those tailwinds that come with it?
Yeah, I mean, you've hit on, in my opinion, a big part of our company's strategy, which is to be an enabler, be a supporter. So much of the climate transition is hardware driven. How can software support that and make it as fast and as cheap as possible? We're doing that by crunching the data on these programs and then distributing it to people who use it. Others, like these decarbonization marketplaces, have found a massive pain in finding qualified contractors. In the US, we have labor shortages for all the skilled trades. So that matters a ton for every single person trying to put in something new in their home or in their business. For market entry, I mean, it depends. If we're talking about startup hardware manufacturers who are trying to provide clean technologies, when it comes to playing around with your entity structure to create tax liabilities to then offset those liabilities, I don't even want to suggest that I have any answer there, because that, I think, would put me in murky waters. But in terms of helping others, yes, there is a huge amount of value to be had in the entire experience from a homeowner's perspective, for example. Even knowing that I could upgrade a part of my home could be an opportunity, all the way to how do we educate more electricians and get them building systems faster. So anything in between from that entire range of experience is needed. And I think that any of you who are building companies that can participate, and it seems like all of you are, will find a way to provide value there for some segment. I know that's really vague, so would love for someone to, because I tried to map the people here to the companies, and I would love to be able to do that. So if anyone has a particular question, yeah.
Daniel's put one in the chat. and Daniel's over in the US at the moment, and I think may have patchy Wi-Fi, but he says to be clear, can a company supply a service to a US company from Australia and then the US company claim the tax credits?
Yeah, indeed, yes. I mean, first of all, the irony of him being in the Bay Area and there's no Wi-Fi. I mean, who knew? They have
I'm hotspotting actually, so
oh,
yeah.
Australia has better Wi-Fi.
I'm literally right next to Google Office as well, so you think there should be good comms somewhere around here.
There you go. And yes, absolutely, that's how it worked. Now, where the people are stumbling is that, well, how do these tax credits make their way back to Australia, if at all? So right now, there's actually no incentive or no reason for that US company to share that tax incentive with their suppliers, essentially, unless there's a bit more of a stronger relationship, such as, well, actually, it's a subsidiary, or we've got an offtake agreement, etc. Now, if this was critical minerals and batteries, it's a bit easier, again, because you being in Australia providing critical minerals or batteries to the US producer, you're actually helping them become compliant with the IRA. So you're actually supporting them being able to access the IRA. Not the same can be said about other services and products yet, which is why it gets a bit more. So if you were a battery supplier, critical mineral supplier, you could just go, hey, if it wasn't for me, you'd be sourcing this from China and you wouldn't get the tax credit. So please share that tax credit with me.
But there's no obligation to share, right? I mean, the way
No, absolutely not.
Yeah. I mean, the way I've seen it is, we can supply service to a US company, they get a tax credit, great, they're more likely to buy our product, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Short version.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Oh, Neil, did you have any questions, or maybe like a little 2-minute overview of what you guys are doing at SIM?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to sort of elaborate on one of the points. So yeah, we're definitely finding that certainly compared to the Australia, the real estate firms are kind of slow to adopt kind of technology. Certainly more kind of offline focus. I think Gut Check, I totally agree with. I was just going to kind of ask really any sort of advice on trying to kind of speed that up, essentially, or kind of any thoughts on kind of good angles that we could kind of try to exploit
for selling to real estate companies. There's a really old joke here where that's the $1 billion idea or something, or the $1 billion statement. Real estate seems to be a very who you know sort of business in the US. I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case everywhere. So, like any enterprise sales cycle, really understanding who is deciding what things and why matters. A tidbit for upgrading buildings. So you have a building, you have a portfolio, sure you know that. The asset managers are, if they know, for example, they will need to replace a roof on a warehouse, let's say, and they will need to do it within about 2 years. Trying to sell them a solar plus roof upgrade when they know they have a couple of years of useful life is probably not the right time. So if you've heard that in Australia, it may be in parallel here. I think that could be to your advantage. If you already have found a way around that there, you'll understand how to speak to them here on some level. But they are very conservative with any change to the way the portfolio operates, because real estate makes money slowly, and it always has. One funny quote I heard is everybody who has a roof that's good for solar has already been called in the US, because it's so obvious where there's a lot of sun and where there's a lot of big buildings. So that is probably not easy unless you have a really amazing competitive advantage. I speak from experience trying to do that for about 10 months. I would say that finding out who is providing money to the portfolio owner, who are their investors, understand whether that portfolio even has any kind of impact or carbon commitment at all, is probably a good place to start to see if you can have leverage there. Because not every owner here cares at all. They see this as a compliance exercise, not impact. But that might change if they're LPs or they themselves have a different mindset. So hopefully that's helpful. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you very much.
Can I ask another question? Sorry, about I had to take a call partway through the early part of the presentation, so apologies if I missed this. It's sort of like a detailed question of what sort of projects qualify for it. Is it just anything that helps the energy environment of a building? Is that like a short version of it?
Yes.
So it's the overarching concept is anything that supports the energy transition, but then there's I think it's divided into segments in terms of automotive, buildings, energy generation. But yeah, I'm not off the top of my head. I can't remember what these are, and there's it's apportioned along those segments.
Okay, thank you. I assume it's audited. It's not self-assessment, right?
Yes. Yeah, it's not self-assessed.
Thanks.
Hi, all. Just wondering if I could quickly jump in, as I love the point that Daniel mentioned on claiming the tax credits and that availability for U.S. companies. By intro, so I'm with Investment New South Wales, based within our New York office. And one really interesting trend that we've seen is kind of in complement to the IRA, each unique U.S. state, they kind of have their own separate funds of whether it's a green fund or a climate fund that's being allocated into certain projects, some of them kind of based on financial incentives for whether it's buildings or other kind of residential, commercial spaces to adopt whether it's EV fleet management or EV charging stations, whether it's sustainable buildings in the sense of solar kind of renewable energy, solar rooftops, etc. And so where we do see that one as well, to the fantastic point made, is incentivizing some of these agencies to, if it's a U.S. agency, to look into that, whether it's an available tax credit, whether it's a grant, to leverage those funds to start looking at those implementation projects for clean technology. And for our Australian clean tech companies, we see that as a proposition for them to kind of discuss with these US stakeholders. If the money is already available for you to look into implementing these sustainable projects, that's where the funding comes in. And then that's where the opportunity comes in to some of our climate tech companies to provide their services to help with the, whatever individual or whatever commercial group that might be looking at adopting that technology, if that makes sense.
Okay. So just so that we're clear, the question is the question around how the states are also doing things to further incentivize change?
Oh, apologies for that. So I'm actually US based. We're working to support the cohort, but it's not as much of a question as much as it is an observation. So that we've seen different states have these unique pools of funding, such as, adopting technology for electric vehicles or adopting technology for smarter buildings. They're different, kind of in complement to the IRA. There are different grants, financing, kind of tax rebate programs that incentivize some of the US companies to adopt this technology, but just noting that we see that as an interesting opportunity for the US stakeholders to have avenues for funding to adopt these kind of green implementation projects. And that funding can go towards service providers such as within our Australian Cleantech companies, to provide that service, given that the US stakeholders now have access to the funding to either partially or in some great circumstances fully cover the adoption of this technology.
Yeah, well put. I mean, if you think about yourselves as valuable vendors for whatever it is you're providing, if your customers can do everything that they wanted to do anyway more cheaply with tax credits, then that means that they have more money for you, in theory.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. Are there any last minute questions for Kyle? Ellie's had to jump off, but any other questions for the boots on the ground founder experience? No, Kyle, you've done such a good job. There's no questions.
I don't know about that.
No, it was wonderful to hear from you, and thanks for staying up a little bit later than I'm sure you usually do to chat to us. If there's like one website that you'd recommend having a look at to kind of understand the IRA a little bit more, is that the one you've put in the chat, the irs.gov one, or is there another that you recommend? Oh, I think you're on mute.
Oops, I'm sorry. Some 2021 vibes right there. I would say that, yes, if you want to know the precise language and exactly what's happening, the IRS, that summary website is where they are keeping track of all the announcements they make as they're putting out updated guidance. So what Elie was saying about how some things are not known, that's true. The US government is still writing regulation on this law because it's so new and so huge. So that's where you can follow updates. In terms of what is possible for maybe some of your customers at the residential scale, here's a nonprofit that's doing something somewhat similar to us with a more educational scope. Rewiring America is really great. We've talked to some of their team, and you can use their savings calculator to get an idea of how a different type of person in America would benefit from the IRA, specifically given some of their demographic information. So this could be a useful way for you to know from a tax perspective how some of your end customers, if you're not B2C, may benefit, and then how you could help your B2B customers think through some of these problems. Or if you are B2C, then maybe it is useful.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kyle. And thank you, Kylie, for coming along and bringing Elie into the presentation. I think he had a fantastic perspective to share. If there aren't any other questions, I'll give you back the 2 minutes left of the workshop, and we'll see some of you on Friday for our in-person New York cohort kickoff.
Right.
Wonderful.
Thanks, guys. Awesome.
Thanks, Kyle.
Thanks, team. Thanks, Kyle.